Hi everyone, thanks for coming back for part 4. I thought it was interesting that it ended over here in Acts 28 verse 11. I just happened to notice that it was in verse 11 that it talks about Castor and Pollux. I had forgotten about that verse, but this is what it's all ultimately about. It's about DNA, and Castor and Pollux are the two stars that are in the constellation Gemini. And I had made a comment in the description of my last video that if you go to the midpoint of the blood moon pattern, the very middle of the pattern is January 5th, 2015. And if you add 1,260 days to that, it just so happens to be June 18, 2018, which is in the constellation Gemini. And I just want to thank Arthur Prudent for pointing this out, but not only does June 18, 2018 have a lot of sixes in it because it's a 6 month, and then 18 is 3 times 6, and then the year is 18, so again you have 3 times 6. But June 18, 2018 happens to be the 169th day of the year, and then there's 196 days left in 2018. So again, you have the 6-9, and then the 9-6, and a 9 is basically a 6 upside down. So again, you have a lot of sixes with this date, and this falls within the constellation Gemini. And like I said, that's really what it's all about. It's all about DNA, which I believe is represented by the constellation Gemini, and it's represented by the two witnesses, which I believe represent the restored DNA. And I just happened to notice that it mentioned Castor and Pollux over here in Acts 28, starting with verse 11, and so conveniently they're mentioned in verse 11. And I had noticed that before, but I had completely forgotten about it, and I remembered it again when I saw this. And then I remembered about Arthur Prudent's comment about how June 18th is the 169th day of the year and 196 days remaining. And it's in the constellation Gemini, which often is represented right side up and upside down because it represents the current condition and the DNA. And so that's what it's really all about. It's all about DNA, and that's why I think it's really important that the 8-year-old boy from Sweden got the location of Mount Sinai correct. I believe the correct location is in the Sinai Peninsula. I believe God is confirming that location, and that's really important because that really completes the imagery here and confirms the imagery here of what this represents and how it represents the DNA. And I want to get back to this word Giza in the Hebrew, which is Strong's number 1503, and I want to talk a lot more about it, but for now I just want to mention that over here in Isaiah 11:15, where it said, "And the Lord shall utterly destroy the tongue of the Egyptian sea, and with his mighty wind shall he shake his hand over the river, and shall smite it in the 7 streams, and make men go over dry shod." And I had explained in my last video how the tongue of the Egyptian sea refers to the Suez Canal, and so I think it's important that it's on this side of the DNA strand, because as I mentioned before, the leading strand would be on the right. So this is the same thing that's being depicted by the millstone being cast down, because this side of the DNA strand is being restored, and this part is cast down and destroyed, and then being restored with the correct DNA, which is basically the imagery that I'm seeing throughout the Bible. And then it goes on to saying, with his mighty wind he shall shake his hand over the river, which again could be talking about the Red Sea, but it's also alluding prophetically to the Euphrates River, which will also dry up. And as I've mentioned before, that's a representation of the 144,000, the two myriads of myriads that make up God's army. And the way that I know that it's referring to God's army, as I've talked about before, is because of the color jacinth, which is one of the colors that Lucifer is missing. So this can't be talking about fallen angels. This is talking about the restoration. And it says he shall smite it in the 7 streams. And then I believe when you see the number 7, that's referring to the church, the 7 candlesticks. So again, this is referring to God's army, to the restoration once the corrupted DNA is destroyed and the restoration takes place. And they go over the Euphrates River, and then it goes on to say, then there shall be a highway for the remnant, which the remnant is the 144,000 of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day he came up out of the land of Egypt. And you see the remnant talked about in Romans 11, which again you have the number 11, but this is where it talks about the 2 olive trees and how they're grafted together, and they both partake in verse 17 of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, which is Jesus. But then it goes on to say in verse 18, boast not against the branches, but if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. So this is where that verse ends, because you have a semicolon over here. So this is the grafting together of the 2 olive trees. Okay, so if you go back up to verse 5 is where it talks about the remnant. It says, even so then at this present time there is also a remnant according to grace. So you had a remnant in the Old Testament that was 7,000 men. Again, the 7, I believe, represents God's people, represents the church, the 7 candlesticks, which was talked about in Zechariah 4, but then it's talked about in the New Testament as well. And then you have a remnant that's Jewish, but you also have a remnant that's according to the election of grace. So the remnant will be both Jew and Gentile, will be the 144,000, the bride, which will be made up of Jews and Gentiles. It's also the 2 witnesses that are talked about in Revelation 11, because that is the restored temple. And so this is all about DNA, and like I said, I think it's really important that the boy got the location correct for Mount Sinai, because this is where God made a covenant, and it's also known as Mount Horeb. Because if you look at the word Horeb, you see that it's another word for Mount Sinai, where God gave the law to the Israelites. But as I've mentioned before, there's 17 matches. It's Strong's number 2722, because I believe it's all about DNA. 27 is a number representing the covenants in Daniel 9:27, where Jesus confirms a covenant. But it also comes from another word, a variation of the word Horeb, which is Strong's number 2717. And so you have both the numbers 27 and 17, which I believe represent the year 2017, which is the midnight hour. And the word Horeb means to be desolate, which is what the word Zion means as well, it's a parched place. And as you can see, Horeb was used 17 times. And if you go back to Genesis 1:7, you see that that's when God made the firmament, which divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And so the number 17 is very, because it represents the firmament, and as you can see, the word firmament is used 17 times as well. And it was the firmament that divided the waters. And so this is a representation of the waters being divided, and Mount Horeb is represented by the number 17. The firmament is represented by the number 17. And as you saw with the table on the word mitosis, that came up in verse 2017, in Ezekiel 2017. And so 17 is a number that represents the division or the dividing of the waters, which is a representation of the restored DNA, the two olive trees being grafted together, as you see in this image over here, which is also what's represented in Ezekiel 37, verse 17, which is the two sticks being joined together, which are represented by Ephraim and Manasseh, which represent the Jews and the Gentiles, but it also represents the restored DNA. Another thing that I noticed when I was showing this scripture in Exodus 2018, which looks like the year 2018, is that the 10 commandments were given in verses 21 through 17. So the end of the 10 commandments is given in 2017, and then the trumpet is sounded in verse 18. And so the 10 commandments represent God's covenant, which is represented by the numbers 17 and 27, as I've mentioned many times before. And then the trumpet is sounded in verse 18, which looks like the year 2018. And if you go to Daniel 9:27, which is the last verse of Daniel's prophecy, where Jesus confirms the covenant, if you go to what would be the next verse after that in the next chapter, in chapter 10, verse 1, you see that it talks about the appointed time. And so the point that I want to make is that I believe this pattern is consistent throughout the scriptures. I believe the numbers 17, or the year 2017, which is also represented by the number 27, represents the midnight hour, and then 2018, or the number 28, represents the dawn, the dawning of a new age. The rising sun, which is Jesus, the bright morning star. And I guess I'll end with this, which was written by C.H. Spurgeon. It says over here, "It is best to see Jesus as the sun, but if we cannot do so, the next best thing is to see him as that star which prophesies the day and shows that the eternal light is near at hand. If I am not today all that I hope to be, yet I see Jesus, and that assures me that one day I shall be like him." Incidentally, I had accidentally put G1503, which is in the Hebrew is the word Giza, but in the Greek it's the word equal, and this means to be like, and I had just done that by accident. And so this is comparable to the word Giza in the Hebrew, which I believe represents DNA, the restored temple. And as I've mentioned before, I believe that's why God uses the word pillar, because it has the two L's, which looks like two chromosomes. I believe it's also reflected by the number 19, which adds up to 1010. If you cancel out the zeros, that makes the number 11, just like 911.